I have the key. We're all ready to go.
So last week we stripped the shell and got it all ready to send down for dipping and de-rusting. So we mounted it on its support trolley, loaded it up on the trailer, and took it down to the factory where they're going to dip it. The dipping will remove all the existing paint, and then it'll eat away all the rust. With any luck, when they pull it out of the bath, there'll be something left. That they reckon will take probably 3 to 4 weeks by the time they get through the whole process. And when they're ready to deliver it back to me, it'll be undercoated with some sort of etch primer so it won't flash rust on me. But in the meantime, what I've decided to do is start work on some of the sub-assemblies. So I've been busy ordering parts, and I've picked out a few sub-assemblies that I'm going to target for rebuilding. So last week you watched as we pulled that front sub-assembly that contains all the front suspension and steering out of the car. So I removed that. This week I set about stripping that down and having a look at which bits we can use and reuse. So here's the main cross member. Pretty grubby and dirty, but structurally it's sound. So I've sent that off away to have it sandblasted and powder coated. I then inspected all the various components that come off this, and principal amongst those is things like disc brakes and things. So these discs are shot, so fortunately new rotors are very cheap, and so I've just purchased all new discs, all new rotors, new kingpins, new tie rod ends, and we'll be safe, not try and resurrect any dodgy components. So, one of the things that is pretty important is these front wheel hubs. You see how they have a spline in them where the wheel attaches. That wears, and when that wears, you get a pronounced clunking sound when you touch the brakes or when you accelerate. Actually, they're not overly expensive, so I've elected to buy new hubs at the same time, and that way we'll get rid of that clunking. And same with the disc calipers. I found that refurbishing the disc calipers, buying brand new calipers was only slightly more expensive than refurbishing them. So that's what I've done. So the next sub-assembly I elected to have a crack at was in fact the steering rack assembly. And before anyone criticises, it's not actually clamped in the vise there, it's just sitting in the drawers. That centre tube is actually quite delicate, and if you bend it, then you'll put the whole thing out of alignment. So I stripped it down, and you can see it's fairly grotty. And having stripped it down, I discovered that it needed new bushes in both ends. It needed new bearing and new oil seals. In fact, it was missing a couple of components, and that's one of the lessons out of rebuilding an old car is you really have to assume that nothing is where it should be. Anyway, so I turned up a brand new Delrin bush for the passenger side arm. I made a little support pad and I turned a new brass bush for the column itself and put a new bearing and seal in there. Reassembled it and then found that it bound on the two new bushes because they were obviously fairly close tolerance. But when I actually inspected it, I found that the tube that holds the two ends together had actually had a good ding in it, and the two ends didn't actually line up. And you can see here that it's off-centered. So the tube just holds the ends together. So I used a bit of brute force and ignorance and essentially bashed it back into position. Got them to line up, and then it all reassembled nicely. Put it all back together, put new tie rods on it, and all done. So that's assembly number 2, all finished. So the next project I picked was, for want of anything better to do, was this stupid heater assembly. The one that came with the car was a complete disaster. and the bottom part was just too rusty to be recovered. So I found another one from a second-hand place in Sydney and got it at a fairly reasonable price, and the metalwork was largely intact, so I was able to recover, repair, de-rust, and do all that myself. I disassembled it, tested the motor, tested the heater core, um, painted everything, put it all back together, tested it, and it looks $1,000,000. The only thing that it needs now for completion is a couple of the clips. So to hold it together, I'm just waiting for them to come back from the electroplater. So I often paint my own parts. This largely depends on how badly rusted or they are when I first get them. If they're really badly rusted, then it's easy to send them down to the powder coater. They give them a really good, serious uh, um, sandblasting with a big industrial sandblaster before they powder coat them, and ultimately it does a really good job. For the smaller things, I can fit them in my sandblaster, and so I can do them myself. So, here's a selection of things that I've done myself, and that's easy, and you can do it as you go, so it works out quite well, really. Um, the heater assembly you saw just before was something that I painted myself. It does a reasonable job, and it's quite durable. It seems to work pretty well. So continuing on with the theme of sub-assemblies, here you can see the gearbox mount. It consists of the two parts here. There's the sub-assembly or the sub-frame, and then there's this butterfly thing that actually bolts on the gearbox and then settles down onto the frame. And this butterfly thing is just all wrong. The rubber blocks that are in it are off a completely different model and used in a completely different place. And the way they're mounted here doesn't allow the bolt to move up and down the way it's quite supposed. So we disassembled it, painted the bits, got the proper rubber gaskets that have to go in here, and then we just put it all back together. But getting these rubber things through these little holes it's a beautiful piece of British engineering, but it's disproportionately difficult, as you can see in this little video. So I struggle with it to get it in without busting it.
So these things are right bastards. This is a rubber gearbox seal, and you've got to feed that part through that little hole, and you end up with something that looks like this. But it's a prick. So, like all things, plenty of lube. Plenty of lube. That goes that way, so we put cord through there. Done. Without tearing it.
With that done, it's time to assemble the tail shaft and universal joints. So we've got some new universal joints, and really just a matter of putting it together. So here we go. What I'm doing about here is making a little stuffing gasket that goes around that ring that you see there, and when you slide the two parts together, this ring compresses around the thing and it really just stops the grease from that spline leaking out all over the thing. But you can't buy them anymore, so it's a matter of fabricating one up, a little bit of cork and some felt, and here it is in all its glory. The important thing to note is actually that the two bits, when you spline them together, need to line up so that the yokes on the actual universal joints match. At least on the MG, that's how they're done.